Our next speaker, I'm pleased to say, is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, Berkeley, and writes for such libertarian journals as the San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. He's written several books, including a book that we have for sale in back called The City, A Global History. He isn't a free marketeer libertarian, at least not necessarily by our standards. By some people's standards he might be. But I think he'll be able to give us a reality check, kind of an outsider's view of what's happening in America, what's happening to cities. Our next speaker, Joel Kotkin. Thank you very much for coming.
You know, Randall is very anti-planning, except when it comes to conferences. Then he becomes like the, the planner from hell. I'm just kidding. Okay. Anyway, I just want to talk to you a little bit about first I'll start off with something that the discussion in this room was very interesting when they came to the topic of who's going to have or who dominates the discussions about transportation planning or zoning or anything like that. And one thing that I've noticed over the years is particularly now, and I think more and more, the middle class, the working class, and small business and suburban interests are almost completely out of the picture. When I have spoken to groups that are in this sort of urban game, the inner city game, let me put it this way, they got a lot more money than you do. And that what's interesting is what might be thought of as a bunch of conservative right-wing lunatics by some people are much less well-funded than the left-wing lunatics. And unfortunately, that I think is the environment that we're in today. And so I'm very glad to have a chance to talk to you. The Congress of New Urbanism was going to have me, and then they decided that I was not quite up to speed for them. So at least I can say I did this one. And I think what we're seeing is a really major issue, which I think is what attracted me here today, and one of the reasons I'm very glad that Randall did invite me, and that's a whole issue that, and I'm going to discuss it in a different way, that has been almost completely lost, and that is the issue of middle and working class empowerment through the ability to buy a house. And that has been really lost in a lot of this discussion and is almost completely lost in the discussions of new urbanism. I have some agreements with new urbanism, but one thing that they do not say, and I think somebody from San Jose was mentioning, that the issue of cost, for instance, is not considered to be a relevant concern. Well, in my household it's a concern, and in most people's households it's a concern. So what we have is this kind of weird universe we live in today in which the left is the most gentry class in America now, the best funded, their strongest support. I'm writing an article for the Los Angeles Times about this now, how the left has become really ensconced in the absolute wealthiest congressional districts, has the most access to the most money, and is driving their agenda. And what bothers me about that is I don't think that that's very left. Just so you a little bit of honesty here. I was raised in a social democratic tradition. My grandparents were from Russia. Those who were participants in the revolution were tended to be more on the anarchist side, which you might appreciate a little bit. And of course, they did not make it to the United States. My grandmother was a member of the Young People's Socialist League. She was arrested at Margaret Sanger rally. And I still think that many of the values I was taught as a child were important values. The essence of progressive politics, in my mind, is to figure out how people can get their own property and raise their families in a manner that provides them with privacy, dignity, and choice. That would be sort of, and I think that's traditionally where the Democratic Party once was. It's not what the Democratic Party has becoming, which is about how make Barbara Streisand, Laurie David, or some hedge fund manager feel better about themselves. That's sort of the new democratic politics, and I'm pretty disgusted with it myself. And I have to say that there is a very interesting website called New City in Australia, and there are a bunch of guys in the Australian Labour Party, and they're sort of on to the same issue. They even reprint Wendell stuff, and They reprint my stuff, and I think there is kind of a growing sense that these issues about housing, the availability of housing, and giving people choices in housing are basically not just conservative issues, but they should be democratic or progressive issues, if you want to use those terms. Now, what I do think is happening, and I'll use a little bit of my, I was a student of the late Michael Harrington, some of you may have heard of, and also schooled by another man named Allard Lowenstein, who was also a very famous person in more liberal politics. And I tend to look a little bit about what's going on the Democratic Party and in the environmental movement as also something about being green both ways. In other words, being green politically, ideologically, and also having a great deal of greed involved in it. What you're seeing is that a large part of the business community is perfectly willing to welcome new restrictions on the development because they inherently raise the value of their property. If you can't develop as a small developer, then, and the process is so politicized that you cannot do anything unless you go through the system, then you end up with an idea that those who can get through the system can ask a maximum. I don't think this is a confidence, but I was on a panel at Lehman Brothers, and I gave a presentation, and Mort Zuckerman was on the dais, one of the people supposed to be questioning me, and I said, Mort, I want to ask you a question. I said, how come you only buy property in Boston, New York, and San Francisco? And Mort's a very good reason, because I don't ever want to go to Houston where some idiot can build something right next to me. I want to be in a place where I have enough money, enough power, that I can outlast the competitor. And if I build a building, I know that there aren't going to be 5 other buildings built at the same time. That showed me a little bit about where this is all going. And I think what you are seeing now is that this is a very important moment, because this money interest, which will include the hedge fund guys who are going to try to game the carbon trading, believe me, that's going to happen. You've got those guys, and they're lined up with the big property owners, and then the Greens, who in many cases they also fund. And what they are getting to do now is do what has long been their desire, which is, I think Joel Schwartz mentioned that I was darting from group to group, trying to pick up little pearls of wisdom from you. And they're basically using global warming as the latest reason for attacking suburban single-family homes. They tried obesity, and they tried peak oil, and then they tried community distress, and then there was a period where they're going about how everyone was getting run over, and now they've got global warming, and that's going to work. So Al Gore, of course, who lives far better than I'm sure anyone in this room and consumes more energy than anyone in this room, is creating a lobby to, helping to create a lobby that will undermine the prospects of future generations of Americans to do what we did and what our parents did. I find it unacceptable as a person with these values I was brought up with to say to a working class Hispanic who came to California 20, 30 years ago that you don't have a right to work hard and buy a single-family home. I just think it's unethical and immoral, and if I had time to look it up in the Talmud, I'm sure they would agree with me. So I think that what we're talking about is what there is this desire, as people begin to have some degree of affluence, to have a place of their own. And there was a great urbanist from Italy who settled in Los Angeles in the 1960s, Edgardo Contini, and he wrote, "The suburban house is the idealization of every immigrant's dream, the vassal's dream of his own castle. Europeans who come here are delighted by our suburbs. Not to live in an apartment. It is a universal aspiration to own your own home." And I've never seen a better statement about what this is all about. And as Wendell has done great work on, this is true in New Zealand, in Australia, and Canada, and Italy, and Spain, and in China where they can afford it, in Japan where they can afford it, and even the French, who I know through my wife's mother is from Paris, and Wendell I know has had many associations there, and the French, they love their pied-à-terres and all that, but where is the population going? It's going to the outer ring. So what I see happening is this universal aspiration, which is really basically, in my sense, very fundamentally democratic and socially just, is now being threatened by what I would call the outbreak of the Green Terror. And I think that's what we're going to be living with in the next few years. And it's going to be a very nasty social struggle. And what's going to make it particularly intense is you have on the one hand this idea of this universal aspiration, and on the other hand is the fact that there's a group of people who want to squash it. And so you've got two things happening at the same time. Now the fight is over, in many cases, where is the future of urbanism? And I'm going to try to lay out a little bit about where I think urbanism is going, and then try to put it, I'm working on a paper with Chapman University and with Reason, sort of discuss where this is. So for Sam Staley, who must be here somewhere, that this is going to be something that hopefully we're going to be publishing fairly soon. Traditionally, cities were unique in that they were the places where culture, commerce, religion, and information were generated. Everything else was kind of out of it. Karl Marx wrote about the idiocy of rural life. In the past, urbanists saw the periphery and the rural hinterland as simply a place to escape, recharge, and relax, but nothing could actually serious happen there. Socrates said the country places and the trees don't teach me anything, and the people in the city do. And I think that was very much true through almost all history. In my book, the history, which is called the City of Global History, talks a lot about that. When did that start to change? And because one of the things we don't understand is, why did we have the rise of suburbia? Nobody ever kind of thinks of it, like, it really wasn't like in the movie Roger Rabbit, it wasn't General Motors, and it wasn't a conspiracy. I always love these when I write a piece and some guy at Daily Kos, besides accusing me of living in the McMansion and driving a Range Rover, neither of which I do, starts off by saying, well, of course people didn't go to the suburbs because they wanted to. They were sort of forced into it by some sort of brainwashing from Madison Avenue or something. What really happened was quite a bit more interesting, and I talk about this in the book. There was something called the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution increased densities to unbelievable levels, 2-3 times what they had been in the classical cities. And to see what those early industrial cities were like, you just have to go to Mexico City or Bombay, and you get an idea of what life was like there. And Frederick Engels, one of my favorite books, is The Condition of the Working Class in England, and Engels tells you what it really was like. I mean, unlike contemporary postmodernist Marxists, Engels was both a good writer and a good reporter. You can disagree with his conclusions, but his reporting was quite good. So this Manchester that he's talking about in the 19th century had a death rate about 3 times that of the surrounding rural areas. And the rural areas didn't have doctors, and maybe that helped them too. But the fact of the matter is that there was this terrible world that had been created, and it was just psychically difficult to. Sigmund Freud writes about in Civilization and its Discontents about the cultural frustration of people who had come from a village or come from a rural community, and all of a sudden in a world where all that mattered was money, and it was a very difficult adjustment, and space was very, very dear. So what happened is, basically, there was a reaction against this. Now, in the Western societies, I think that the first reaction was the rich people. They moved to the countryside, and of course the rich industrialists married the daughters of the feckless aristocracy, and they went and lived in Masterpiece Theater and became very sensitive. You always wonder, like, how do these people afford to do nothing but moan about themselves? Well, because they stole it from other people. And of course, the middle class, which had to run these enterprises, they moved upwind. And in almost every city, you have people moving up to where the air was not quite as putrid. The working class got screwed. They stayed closer to where the factories were, and that's why you had these tremendous densities, because people early on were walking to these places. And interestingly enough, the one place where the proletariat overthrew the capitalists was in the city of St. Petersburg, which, by the way, had the worst health conditions in all of Europe. So what fortunately happened is that whereas the Russian workers won to their own regret, in the Western societies we came up with a more pragmatic way of coping with urban dysfunction. And I think this is one of the things that was great, and I think something that progressives should look at as a positive, which is there was a development of sanitation and building parks. But what was really interesting in doing the research is many people who we would call progressives were very much in favor of suburbanization. They said the obvious solution to crowding was to move people out. So you built commuter rail at first, and wasn't this a great thing? People could live in a more dispersed manner, and you could do it very intelligently in the Garden City idea and have the businesses there too. But, at least, it wouldn't be so awful. And these are really important ideas. They really changed the world, and they were very attractive in the United States because Americans sort of have a natural desire for the ownership of property. That's one of the reasons many of our ancestors, no matter how long your ancestors have been here, you can trace it to somebody who wanted a piece of property of one sort or another. And also there was a inchoate longing for the natural environment. So the American city dweller, although not as bad as in Europe, looked around and said, well, what are we going to do? And I was reminded of this recently because I took my eldest daughter to the Tenement Museum in New York City. If you've ever been there, it's a great place. And she was shocked because we went into this little apartment, can't be, maybe from here to here, family of 4, and they had a sewing machine, which is where they made their living, and that's how they lived. I mean, this is new urbanism, right? How we should all live. So they're in this place, and she said, I don't believe people could live that way. So we took the train back to my mother's, and my mother explained exactly what it was like to live that way. The only wildlife that they saw was what they didn't want to see. And my mother grew up in a place, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the community of Brownsville, Brooklyn. Okay. And I won't use her language, but she said it was a crummy neighborhood then, and it's a crummy neighborhood now. And so people had a desire. You're living in an apartment with 5 brothers and sisters. It's not this romantic idyll that Richard Florida and Andres Duany would like to portray. And their response to this dense urban living, which is what, of course, they're trying to push, is get me out of here. And that's what they did. So what happened? After the Second World War, particularly, the process had started earlier. It had been delayed somewhat by the Depression and the Second World War. There was this move into the suburbs, which is exactly what planners, the Greens, the property magnates generally don't want to see anymore. And they attack it on a lot of bases. And one thing is true. Many of the suburbs were racist. There were a whole bunch of them that didn't allow African Americans. There were some that didn't allow Jews and Asians. But over time, and I'll get into this later, they became essentially very democratic places. My friend, essayist DJ Waldy, called it a humanitarianism backed by economic prosperity. It was the goal of both political parties, from Hoover to Roosevelt to Truman to Eisenhower, all the way through to Clinton, to say our goal is to get people into their own home. It wasn't to get them their piece of a condo. That was fine. That's an alternative, but that's what people wanted. And think about what we did in America. We created the first society of a mass property-owning middle class. 1940, less than 45% of Americans owned their home. In 2005, it was 70%. Now, this is part of the story that, unfortunately, Democrats who could take a great deal of the credit for this don't want to take any of the credit for it. They're kind of embarrassed if you bring it up. It was like the crazy ant in the attic. Yet the great advocate of this, I think, of all, was Harry Truman, who helped push through the GI Bill and things that made it possible for my father and all my uncles who came back from the war to buy a house. The other part of the story was the great entrepreneurial story of innovation. Another story that we don't want to talk about because we didn't, the cognitive elites don't like it. There's a man named William Levitt. I just finished a little essay about him. Hopefully you'll see it in the next week or two. And he learned this technology of mass home building during the war. He was in the Seabees. And he figured out that you could build these houses very, very quickly if you use kind of industrial methods. And he put his challenge succinctly. He said, any damn fool can build homes. What counts is how many can he sell for how little. I don't think this is what the Toll Brothers is about. But Levitt's approach has been really vindicated. there was this massive movement of people to where they can afford, basically, in most cases, a suburban home, and predominantly a single-family home. Now, I think that we should see this as a great accomplishment, and what our goal should be as we think about the environment and future society is, how do we make these places better? And I keep urging the new urbanists and other so-called progressives and the Greens that we shouldn't really try to kill these places. I always wonder, like when Kunstler said, the suburbs are going to empty, and they're going to be dysfunctional. I said, well, where are these people going to go? I mean, they can't all move to Boston. And I also think it's kind of somewhat irresponsible to wish upon about 55–60% of the American population the worst possible fate. So I think that's unfortunate is, whereas I would like to see the Greens and others to be involved in how do we make the suburbs better for the environment, how do we make them better for families. Instead, I think they feel that now global warming has given them an opening to essentially impose what they want from above. It's been like, it's a kind of the ultimate trump card. And this is bad on two levels. One, I think there are good ideas and values here that are going to be lost. And I also think a lot of people are going to get hurt. And I think particularly it would be middle working class people and people of the younger generation. Us, as we would say, alter kakas, we already have our homes. And you don't want the Yiddish translation. But basically those of us who bought our homes were okay. But what about the 30-year-old? What about the 25-year-old who wants to buy a home now? And we're going to make that more and more possible. So the question is, how are we going to do this, and how should we approach this issue? And I think part of the problem is there is this definition, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's this definition. Here's the city, and here are the slobs, and everything that's bad is happening out here, and all the good stuff is happening in the city. And the fact of the matter is, the old definitions of urban and suburban, Alan Pisarski was mentioning this earlier, really don't matter anymore. If you look at the 21st century, and I'll talk about this, where I think it's going, you're going to see the individuals, families, businesses will have more freedom to locate where they wish. So we're going to see an archipelago of different kinds of urban environments that will go all the way out to the countryside. Now, two things will be driving this. One, we're going to go from 300 to 400 million people. So I'm writing a book, what are you going to do with these extra 100 million people? That's double the population when President Kennedy was elected. And then we have, obviously, telecommunications and transportation changes that are going to make it possible for people to be in more in different places. And one thing is for sure that if you make cities more congested, all you're going to do is drive them further away because they're going to have a harder time to get there. I think it was Mr. Gavin at a meeting I was with Sam who made that point. If you make it a 2-hour trip to get into Chicago, you know what? You're not going to go to Chicago too often. And this is, I think, what is actually beginning to happen in places like downtown Los Angeles, where you put a cultural facility there, and if it's a Wednesday night and it's 8 o'clock, you really don't want to have to go there. And I think, so what we're talking about is we're talking about a protean change. One of the big problems with new urbanism is that its ideas are very conservative. In other words, they want to go back, or even reactionary, they want to go back to something. I see something else happening, something that's very exciting, and I'm going to go through some of those changes. One is the rapid changes taking place in the places where the growth is going. Phoenix, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta. All these places which are sort of based on what you might call the LA model, multipolar, automotive oriented. This model has always been hated by planners and intellectuals. They used to call LA 19 suburbs in search of a metropolis, less a city than a perpetual convention. Aldous Huxley called it the city of dreadful joy, and William Faulkner called it the plastic asshole of the world. Amazing that all these people came there given these descriptions. But I think this is antiquated. These cities are the cutting edge of how cities are going to be formed and are forming today. It would be like somebody from Renaissance Venice going to Manchester and say, this isn't a city. I remember I was giving a talk at the Harvard Global Cities, and I said, well, I want to talk about Los Angeles and Houston, the new multipolar cities, and somebody from London got up and said, well, these aren't cities. L.A. and Houston, they're not cities. Cities are like how we live, and it's really awful what's happening in London. This is like, I think, the Lord Mayor of London. It was just amazing. She got up and she said, well, It's really terrible. All those people who should be living in the city are living in these awful little suburban bungalows north of London with these little backyards. And I said, well, you know what? That's what they can afford. If they, I said, you have a nice flat in the city. He said, yes. And there were a bunch of them. I said, you all have country homes. Yes. Well, I said, you know what? To that schmuck who lives in, who makes, you know, 20,000, 30,000 pounds a year, that little house in the north of London is the only green space that person sees, you know, 50 out of 52 weeks a year, and this is pretty damn good compared to where they were coming from. So I think that what you're seeing is that these spread out cities, these sprawl cities, if you will, are really the cutting edge. The whole idea of the downtown as the center and everything radiating out is an antiquated concept. Even in places like New York and Chicago, they're losing their percentage of employment. And in many cities like Los Angeles, it's 5% of the total employment of the city. And the employment is moving out. Now, does that mean that this is not a city? No, it's a different kind of city. And part of the problem with the whole debate is their idea of a city is something that was that basically was something that happened in the 1830s to about 1920. The first reference to the word downtown was, I think, in Webster's was around 1880. It didn't exist as a concept. And now we're going to something very, very different. We're going to a multipolar city. That's the predominant pattern virtually everywhere. And so, but these are becoming cities. They are also becoming denser. They're multipolar and becoming denser at the same time. So what you have is a new form of urbanism as opposed to new urbanism. And it's being driven by market forces, the overall rise in population, immigration, energy-related concerns, the desire for shorter commutes, and rising land costs. In other words, people are kind of figuring out at some stage of their lives they want to live, are willing to sacrifice a little bit of space to live a little closer to work or in an environment that allows them to enjoy the things they like in the city. So the most exciting urban development in the United States today is really taking place in the inner rings of Houston, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And the problem is that they're not becoming Manhattan, so they're not urban enough for many urbanists, but they are actually becoming something new and different. If you take a look at Houston, in the 1990s, since the 90s, cities had a huge increase of multifamily construction. When I think Wendell, I know that some of this is from you, some of it is from Randall, but I know that there's been more increase in density in the inner ring of Houston than there has been in the city of Portland, and there's more dense stuff happening through the market there than is happening through planning elsewhere. So what I think you're seeing is a new kind of urban zone. This will be a zone which is, again, automotive-oriented, but it will be, you'll see a dense nodes of homes, townhouses, condos, connected by roads, bus lanes, and fiber optic cables. And I even think there's a role for strip malls. People hate strip malls. I think new urbanists drive around, they see strip malls, and, you know, they got to go, lie down. But, the reality is strip malls are part of the process of a protean, dynamic, urban place. If in most cities in America today, the best ethnic restaurants are in strip malls, because that's where excuse me?
These people, they love a row of shops, provided it's got a sidewalk in front of it. You put a parking spot in front of it, and they hate it. Same thing.
Yeah, well, and I think it's also, I just think it's basically a question of understanding that these different kinds of spaces provide opportunities for people to come in. If you go, the more planned the place, the more boring the shops, generally speaking. So that's one thing. I think that what's happening with urbanism inside these dispersed cities. Second thing I want to just talk about briefly is the idea of what's happening in the countryside. Because of telecommunications, people now can go to other kinds of places, and so they're beginning to look at other ways of living. So, for instance, I used to go to, I go quite often actually to a place called Fargo, North Dakota, and always get some laughs. And Fargo is now becoming very urbanized, because what's happening is people are beginning to figure out that they can live in Fargo, they can get a house for much less money, they have excellent public schools, and so it's really funny. When I first used to go to Fargo, I used to bring my own coffee. I like coffee, and the coffee was really bad, truck driver coffee, and I just you know, I might as well just boil it down the urinal because, cut out the middleman. But, so basically, so what you have is you've got people moving there. Now, with the aging boomers, and I think this came up in a discussion earlier, the idea the aging boomers are all going to move into condos downtown. They're much more likely to move, either stay in the suburbs where they already are, about 70%, or they're going to consider moving to these other places. We're seeing this happening in lots of other places. But what's also interesting is you're starting to see 35, 40-year-olds moving to these smaller towns. So in Fargo, for instance, just to finish that thought, in Fargo they have really good coffee places that are not necessarily Starbucks, and they have, you go to restaurants there and it's a bunch of people dressed in black who look like they came from the Pearl District, and they even have a store called AKA which caters to metrosexuals. So I mean, I think that you're really seeing something really interesting happening. So you have this new urban form developing in the Sun Belt and in the sprawled out cities. You have the suburbs becoming more, having their own centers and having more of their own facilities. You see malls being retrofitted and putting housing in. All these new kinds of urban structures which don't fit the stereotype that the planners want to push on us. So I think that what we're going to see over time is a rapid change in the urban structure. All these places, in my mind, will be cities. They will be cities. They will be urban in that they will have information, they have increasingly cultural institutions, and they will have areas of concourse and rendezvous, not because the planners want it, but because people want it. So, one of the great examples of that ever is Venice Beach in LA, which they just evolved on its own. It's one of the great walking districts in North America. And I think even in LA, we do have legs and we know how to use them. And I think that you're going to see is more and more either in malls or in small towns or in renewed downtowns of suburbs, you will see these new kinds of urban environments rising out of the market. And that we ought to be willing to say that urbanism will come in many, many different forms. On the inner city, I don't write off the inner city. The problem now is the way that they're being run. Their ideal is to end up like San Francisco, which my friend historian Kevin Starr says is becoming a cross between Carmel and Calcutta. Either you are a Trustafarian or you're a homeless person, or you work for the government. I guess you can do that too. I think that cities can, and I'm writing about this, cities can come back. I think some of the older cities that have become very depressed actually have very nice housing and parks, and if their governments could straighten themselves out, I think a lot of young people looking for an urban experience would go to a St. Louis or a Cleveland if those places were cleaned up. If they don't do it, you're going to end up with a few very gentrified cities like San Francisco, like Manhattan, like Boston, like Seattle, like Portland, and they'll be sort of playgrounds for the ageless adolescents. And then you'll have a bunch of really poor cities which will have little Potemkin villages in the middle, and when you come into Cleveland, they'll take you to about 4 blocks and say, oh wow, this is better than I expected. Because if you take a car and you drive around, you'll see something else. So what I'd like to just end up with is it's really important that we begin to talk about a different, more diverse model of the urban future. And it's one that requires imagination, but also some faith in human evolution. I see wonderful things happening all over the world, and certainly all over the United States, that are just happening through the market, through people's desire. When they say these young people want to live in urban areas, well, all right, so then let them live in the urban areas. Don't make it so expensive that you're expecting some 25-year-old to pay $600 a square foot like they do in downtown L.A. Don't be aghast if a suburban area, for instance, like in Atlanta, ends up with the local opera or ballet company. You have to understand that they were seeing this explosion of urbanism all over in different places. And I think this is something that I think is basically positive. Finally, I just want to add a little bit on where I started in the green issue. And I was talking to Joel Schwartz about this, and this is something I'm learning myself now. It amazes me that how little new urbanists and smart growth advocates look at the potential of such things as telecommuting and dispersed work as one way to reduce energy costs. It just astounds me. You look at the word internet and Andres Duani, and they are not on the same page. I guess maybe because neo-Victorian cities didn't have the internet or something, but you know, this idea that we're not going to take advantage of dispersed work so that people can live and work closer to where they, where people can live and work in the same area. And I think, by the way, this is going to happen for a very basic reason. I think the next generation of young people are going to look at an employer who says, you got to drive 60 miles to go from one computer screen to another, and they're going to say, forget about it, as we would say in New York. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just when the baby boomers finally die out, maybe there'll be some reason. And the other thing is, and this was something about the suburbs that I thought was very, very important. There's some really interesting research which Wendell has shared with me, and also some people in Australia have shared with me, which is the idea that it's not necessarily sure that cities are necessarily better for the environment intrinsically than suburban areas. There are studies that show townhouses, even single-family homes, use less energy, and there's this whole argument about urban heat islands, which existed in the 70s and 80s literature. My colleague Ali Medeiros was able to revive it, completely taken out of the discussion. So what's weird is you have this research about urban heat islands. In other words, if you put a lot of concrete and a lot of people and a lot of buildings, and they're glass and metal, and you put them in the middle of Phoenix, the temperature of downtown Phoenix is going to be about 9 degrees Celsius higher than the desert is at night. So, but that whole literature's been gone, and then the lack of concern about telecommuting. So I think what we ultimately need to do is we need to have an alternative vision to the one that's being sold now, which is more density, more planning, and basically everybody but us has to live in a little box. But by the way, there's a wonderful story in the LA Weekly about all the smart growth advocates in LA and where they lived, and they all lived about 2-3 miles from the closest bus stop, which I thought was quite funny. So I think what we have to do is we have to come up with a vision that's different, not a vision that says the environment's not important or that society is not important, but something that's not just environmentally sustainable but socially sustainable, and really beginning to think about how we are going to have a society that works successfully for a large portion of the people. I think this is an area that is going to need a lot of thinking, and also I think there is an opportunity here for a alliance, if you will, between people such as yourselves and people who have been traditionally progressives, who feel increasingly that gentry liberalism really does not have any answers for the critical issues of society. So I just want to just raise that idea to you. I think in Australia that has already started. There are people who are bringing up these issues, understanding that if you legislate against industrial activity in Australia, that activity goes to someplace where it's less regulated and the Australian working class loses their jobs. Start to think about those kinds of issues. Now, not all of them will fit your market matrix and your anti-government matrix in every case, but at least we can start to think about the idea that society to work has got to be socially and economically sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable. And I'll just leave it there.
Hey, Joel, Woody Allen, the quintessential New Yorker, once observed that it was one nice thing about being bisexual was a double chance for a date on Saturday night. Now, I just wanted to mention in favor of this multipolar city that you mentioned, that one advantage of having a lot of dispersed modes is it loads the highway or transit system a lot more efficiently. So, for example, in Los Angeles, rush hour, which admittedly starts at 5 in the morning and goes on until noon, and in the afternoon starts at noon and goes on until 7 or 8. But they do get 33,000 vehicles per lane mile per day, which is by far higher than anywhere else in the country. So they make much more efficient use of the transportation network they have built, because the rush hour now goes in both directions. So you don't have those high queue factors you have with a single center. And it actually works fine for transit. So the city of the future is Los Angeles with multipolar centers with a combination of free lanes and hot lanes with virtual express busways running between them. I think that's a great model. And
it's interesting too, if you look at what's happened is the things that have worked in transit. For instance, I live very close to what's known as the Orange Line, which is a bus rapid transit system. It's been extremely successful. They happen to have a bike lane. I know people have been making comments about the bike lobby, but since I bike everywhere, I sort of kind of like it. And they have a bike lane along that lane, so I get to see it, and it is packed constantly because there are a lot of people, particularly working class people, who really need that transit within the valley. They're not going downtown. They're going to one of the business centers within the valley itself, or they're working, their businesses are dispersed. So I think you don't have to be anti-transit. You can just say, what kind of transit makes sense for the kind of city you are? And what you find is the exact opposite is, this desire and the discussion in this room earlier about transportation and about how at the transportation lobby level, all the power belongs basically to the central city people, and they're pushing the little light rail into the center. And as you know, in many of these places, the light rail into the center is pretty empty. And they built at the same time I don't know if you've studied the gold line going out to Pasadena into downtown, and that thing is empty all the time, because that is not where the commuter is coming from. The commuter is the real need is within the city. And by the way, here's another class issue which I think is important. And I know that Randall's talked about this too. The bus system is what serves working class people who don't have cars, and yet we're willing to sacrifice and increase the price of that service in order to build the light rail. So maybe a few yuppies might take the rail. I mean, so there's a social equity issue. So there are alliances you could make, even with groups that are fairly far to the left, who are saying, if we have X amount of money for transit, it should go for the people who really need it. And we've made that argument quite a bit.
Yeah. There's a trend, I think, that people are not aware of, that more and more people are having second and third homes. And where they are having them is in the outside of the city. And not only outside of the city, they are now building ships where you can rent or you will have a timeshare for a month at a time. Now, more and more of this affluent trend, or what people expect using telecommuting, is totally contrary to the renaissance of the urban. I think that this is very underestimated.
Well, I think there's some very interesting studies done by a woman named Connie Rosenblum at the University of Arizona about what are the behavior patterns really of boomers. And I've worked with Bill Fry at Brookings about this as well. And this idea that they're all, at age 60, they're going, grow their, well, if they can't grow their hair, they're going to have a ponytail with whatever they have, and they're going to move back into the inner city, and they're going to be, this Viagra generation that's going to come in and revitalize the inner city. The fact of the matter is, when you get into your 50s and 60s, the partying is not so important. The activities that you really care about may be more hiking, walking. You may be looking for peace and quiet more than hustle bustle on a regular basis. There's a Canadian demographer named David Foote, and he said the two biggest activities of people as they reach their 50s that increase are birding and gardening. Well, those are not likely to be done in a condo in downtown. I guess you can look at the pigeons, I guess, in Manhattan. But so I think you're right. I think what you're going to see, and I think what happens over time, and this is a very old story, going back to people moving to LA, believe it or not, for the air. We have people with tuberculosis moving to LA, Midwesterners trying to get away from the damp climate. They would come there for several months of the year, and then they would stay. The whole history of Florida. And now I think what you're going to see, and you're already seeing, is some of these resort-type communities beginning to become places where people actually spend more and more of their time, particularly in the case of Florida, where they have much lower taxes. And so, there's all those people in New York they call 6 months in one day. And I think you're right. You're going to see among the upper middle class more of a dispersion than moving into the inner city. have one more.
All right, Owen?
Just to add to that, besides the development of the country I live on, but I decided to put other people like this in the retirement market. I've now sold it. It's actually full of divorced women.
Yeah.
This is a huge migration.
Divorced with children or divorced?
Both.
Okay.
They're single or single with young people with children. And it's simple economics. They're living in the city. The marriage breaks up. They have to split the matrimonial assets. So hubby buys the apartment in the red light district. They want to take the children out.
Those randy New Zealanders.
Because that's where they can afford, and they also get the tools. But if they can't buy back from the downtown market on half the value of the house.
Well, I assume that's happening particularly if, you know, somebody's obviously paying alimony, but one thing we are also seeing sort of parallel to this among the older market is college towns. Lots of college towns are, because you can go into a college town, let's say in central Pennsylvania, which is actually a very beautiful part of the United States, and you can buy something very, very cheaply. And if your kids live in the outer suburbs of Philadelphia, you got a 2-hour drive to see the grandkids. It's not so bad. And the last thing is totally underestimated is the fact that people will move to where their families are, and that I'm working on that right now, and I think this is important part of the research that we're doing, which I have to tell Sam about. But it's very important to understand that people are still family beings. I think the imagery of that the new urbanists like and that the Richard Florida types want is we're all individuals. We don't have families anymore, and when the kids are out of the house, we're no longer parents. Well, you know what? My mom's 85. She's still a parent. You know, I've got a 3-year-old, so I'll be a parent until I'm dead. So, I mean, basically, you really got to look at it that there's a continuum, and that the areas where families can live are going to be intrinsically more attractive than those places which up to now have only been attractive to single, generally younger people.
Thank you very much.